So why would we want to reconnect a floodplain with its burn in a situation like this where man-made interventions have actually separated the burn from the floodplain for drainage purposes? There's several reasons to do this really, and a lot of them are to do with climate change. So we're increasingly facing the threats of more frequent flooding events and more severe droughts as well. By allowing the floodwaters to spill out onto the floodplain more often and more of the time, we're holding water in the catchment. So we're smoothing out, for longer periods of time we're holding water here, so we're smoothing out those peak flows, but also if the water's allowed to naturally flood onto what would naturally be its floodplain and be held there for longer, it has more time to soak down into the ground and recharge the groundwater. And that's important for when we get drought conditions, because that's your reservoir of water to then recharge the rivers and burns over a longer period of time after that. Similar to peatland restoration in a way, the more land that we can keep wet, where it would naturally be damp a lot of the time, the better that is for carbon storage, for retaining any carbon that's stored in that wet ground. And if we can retain some of that particulate carbon in floodplains, again by retaining the water for longer and letting it be settled out there, that's a positive effect on carbon retention and storage. This is Delliefure Farm. We're here to have a look at some floodplain and wetland restoration work on the farm. So this was a project that was done, the thinking about it started probably back in 2020 and it happened about a year ago, so September 2021. The objective to start off with was really to do with a catchment management project. So in common with a lot of the agricultural land in the Spey catchment, this area has been modified by people over the years, by farmers over the years, for the purpose of improving the agricultural land. So you can't see it from here, but there's a burn that runs along one side of this field, and it's been straightened away from its natural course, and embankments built on either side of it to drain the land. Now we know that in a lot of cases that's not helping the functioning of the catchment and isn't terribly beneficial either for the wildlife of the river or the surrounding area. So in some places it's quite appropriate to try and restore back to a more natural situation, which is what we've tried to do here. What we decided to do was a fairly low-key project to reconnect the burn from its floodplain. So with the embankment there, you're not getting the natural exchange of water under flood conditions between the burn flooding out onto the floodplain and all the other things that come with that. So that's all the nutrients in the water to make a properly functioning system. Rather than removing the whole embankment, we just made two lowered areas, some breaches in the embankment, which were designed by professional consultants and designed so that in the top 2% of the range of flow levels that you're getting in the burn there, around about the top 2%, the water will flood over the embankment into the field. And we also did some digger work on the floodplain here to create two larger areas of wetlands, which are wet most of the time. Obviously the water levels go up and down. And the main benefit there is really for some excellent new wildlife habitat, so that's all new freshwater habitat. The involvement of the farmer was really important right from the start. We approached both the farmer and the estate, the landowner, and had some joint discussions with both, and as it turned out, all parties concerned were very happy for the project to go ahead. So we spent some time explaining to the farmer exactly what we were going to do and how it would or wouldn't affect the way he uses the land. And because his family have farmed this land for almost a century, he has a firm attachment to it and a definite sense of responsibility and stewardship for it. And there were certain things that he didn't want us to change, but none of that was anything that was going to compromise the objectives of the project.
I think it's important that any of these interventions we can integrate with traditional farm management, and we're not excluding, large areas of productive ground to the detriment of agricultural productivity. We can do both. We're not asking farmers to take land out of production. We can integrate these two processes together, and I think that's probably a good selling point for some of the services that we can provide.
The Strathspey Wetland and Waders Initiative had identified this a way back as an important farm for waders, and it has been surveyed every 5 years.
That's a fair point to make. There are so many pressures on waders populations that we don't have the same control over. We can do something about the habitat. We can create a mosaic of habitat, of a mixture of wetland. They don't need dense rush, that probably puts them off, but if we can create different heights of vegetation for different stages in the development of each species, then we're taking some of the pressure off.
So yeah, I mean, there has been concerns raised quite rightly and understandably that having too much water in areas where cattle especially are grazing can contribute to diffuse pollution. It's not something we've had too much worry about just here at all. There's plenty of vegetation and rush in between the wetland areas and where the burn is, so that'll act as a natural filter. When the water comes up and is getting potentially a little bit more, will contain more sediment, across the floodplain it won't be flowing very fast, it'll be flowing really quite slowly. So that in fact is one of the benefits of the project, that we want that sediment that originates from the land but also from the river itself. It's coming from higher up in the catchment to settle out onto the floodplain, and that can actually increase the fertility of the land as well, so that'll be quite good for the grass production for the farm too. The other thing is diffuse pollution on farms often happens where cattle have one point or a very concentrated area to drink out of a burn that runs across the land, and it does get very churned up and poached, and that's where you're getting big slugs of sediment going down the river. There is one watering point in the burn here, but now we have these wetland areas. In dry weather that gives alternative places for the cattle to water, and in fact we think that will improve if there ever, I don't think there was a particular risk of diffuse pollution here ever, but that will spread the pressure of where the drinking points are. The cattle have more than one place to go and drink, they don't all have to trample one area, so in fact I think that'll be a positive effect on that. One of the principles behind catchment management is trying to do different projects at different scales, but the whole process adding up to a much bigger, more integrated impact on the catchment as a whole.
And the National Park also have a programme of various projects under the Heritage Horizons banner, and there are 4 floodplain restoration projects within that as well. I think there's the Slug and Burn, the Mar floodplain, Brecon and Cairngorm Loch. So that's all under a work in progress just now, and if we get our delivery phase next year, there'll be fairly significant investment into those restoration projects. So there's a lot going on across the area.
From our side, as the fishery boards, the rivers trusts and catchment management organisations like ourselves can access other sources of funding which maybe wouldn't be as familiar to the farming sector, and we can either put those together with farming subsidies or they can stand alone, so that, you know, what we don't want to do is put any additional burden on farmers. There's enough challenges there already, so we can bring in funding from other sources.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that, you know, we would encourage farmers and crofts to get in touch with us, because we've got a less prescriptive resource to be able to employ that we hopefully is going to align farms and crofts much more with future subsidy payments. I think it's going to be much more environmentally focused going forward. I think there's a recognition that the current prescriptive national funding schemes are not the best and they could be dramatically improved. I think they've been better in the past. Maybe some of the older rural priority schemes were a bit more flexible and a bit more reflective of people's needs. But this current set of support mechanisms are not, and I think that will evolve hopefully going forward, and anything we can do to support farms and crofts into that system is really quite high priority for us. We want to work with farmers to try and assist them, not put barriers in their way, and hopefully we've got some really good people with good knowledge that can provide specialist advice.